Hello and welcome. In today's lesson, the Group 4 will introduce and discuss the history of Western art. The topics will be tackled are Post-Impressionism, Fauvism, Expressionism, and Cubism. The Group 4 will introduce themselves. Hi, and good afternoon everyone. I am Marian Amiego, and I will be discussing the introduction, the summary, and the quote of the day.
A pleasant afternoon, everyone. My name is Crismavic Malasio, and I will discuss about the characteristics and artworks in Post-Impressionism.
Good day, everyone. I am James D. Bishon, and today I will be discussing about Expressionism, the definition, history, concepts, styles, and trends.
Hello, my name is Maya Marin Gilpi Marstella, and I will discuss the characteristic, important artwork, and artist of Expressionism.
Hi everyone, my name is Kaina Marie Ailey Pitin, and I'll be discussing the characteristics and some artworks on Fauvism movement.
Hello everyone, my name is John Reniel Miasco, and I'll be discussing all about the importance of artwork and the artist of Cubism.
Hello everyone, my name is Maris T. Paragoso, and I will be discussing the definition, history, and characteristic of Post-Impressionism.
Hey everyone, I am Jeremy M. Yamedo. I will discussing about Fauvism and the history of Fauvism.
Now that you've met the members, let's fasten our seatbelts and let's begin.
Post-Impressionism. Post-Impressionism encompasses a wide range of distinct artistic styles that all share the common motivation of responding to the opticality of the Impressionist movement. The movement ushered in an era during which painting transcended its traditional role as a window onto the world and instead became a window into the artist's mind and soul. In the history of post-impression, it started on early 1880s and ended on 1914. Impressionism and the rise of post-impressionism. Monet's painting Impression, Sunrise of 1872, ushered in a new mode of visual expression by which artists responded to their modern surroundings. The critic Louis Leroy derisively dubbed her style of painting Impressionist because of the visible brushstrokes. Their core membership consisted of Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, and Berthe Morisot. Among them was Paul Cézanne, who exhibited with Impressionists during the 1870s and early 1880s. After the last Impressionist exhibition in 1886, younger artists and critics demanded a shift in the focus of the representational arts. Eventually, these dissenting artists became known as the Post-Impressionists. Many of the movement's foremost figures were rivals in method and approach. The emphasis on symbolic and expressive content meant that the life of the city no longer was a dominant subject for artists. Cézanne spent most of his career in Provence. Van Gogh arrived at his mature style in Arles. Gauguin expatriated to Tahiti. Post-Impressionism, concepts, styles, and trends. Seurat and Pointillism. Georges Seurat developed the style of painting known as Pointillism, which refers to the use of a point or dot as the basis for the construction of a painting. Seurat explored a new, scientific approach to the representation of color and extended the Impressionist interest in optics. The marks that made up the painting were each executed in a singular color. Van Gogh and Japonism. Van Gogh relied upon saturated colors and broad brushstrokes to evoke the inner turmoil of the artist. He was influenced by a variety of sources, not the least of which was his love of the stylized representations of Japanese ukiyo-e prints. Toulouse-Lautrec was an observer of the cabaret world with a unique perspective. He was born into French nobility but was physically disabled and embodied the perspective of both an insider and an outsider. Gauguin and Synthetism. In 1888, Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin shared a small apartment and studio space in Arles, in the south of France. While they both shared an interest in symbolic content and images that were abstracted from their natural appearances, Gauguin developed these ideas further in his theory of synthetism. Its visual form is determined by a synthesis of the outward appearance of the natural form, the artist's feelings about the subject matter, and the aesthetic considerations of color, line, and form. Next reporter will be Miss Militia to discuss the remaining characteristics and also to discuss the artworks in Post-Impressionism. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Paragoso, for that wonderful introduction. Cézanne and the structure of pictorial form. Paul Cézanne forged a link between Impressionism and Cubism. He explored the underlying formal structure of still lifes, portraits, and landscapes. His innovations were tremendously influential for the masters of modernity like Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso. By using planes of color to create these shapes, he partially merged parts of figures in the foreground with elements of the background. Rousseau and Primitivism. Many post-impressionists were drawn to primitivism in their search for more vivid styles and symbolic content. Henri Rousseau was championed as a pioneer, but it can also refer to the borrowing of non-Western art forms by artists like Picasso and Gauguin. His representation of the realm of dreams in a uniquely intuitive style proved highly influential for the Fauves, Cubists, and Surrealists. Lein Nabi, derived from the Hebrew word for prophet, and heralded the group's core ideology, a blend of mysticism and the inner spirituality of the artist. Paul Cézanne founded the group and refined the style that came to dominate the production. Lein Nabi exhibited together from 1892 through 1899 and embraced a variety of media including painting, prints, stained glass, and stage sets. They were influenced by Japonism, symbolist painting, and the English pre-Raphaelites and used paint right from the tube in broad, unmodulated areas of color. Important artworks and artists of Post-Impressionism. Sunday Afternoon in the Island of La Grande Jatte. Artist Georges Seurat. Seurat's Sunday Afternoon is perhaps the most famous example of the painting technique known as pointillism. Seurat composed the entire scene from a series of small, precise dots of color. He did so in order to bring structure and rationality to what he perceived were the triviality and disorganization rampant in Impressionism. The picture contains the impressionistic elements of light and shadow and depicts the leisure activities of Parisian bourgeoisie. Vision after the sermon. French artist Paul Gauguin painted Vision after the sermon, which depicts a revelatory vision of Jacob wrestling with an angel. He rejected the conventions of industrialized modern society through romanticized evocations of the primitive, incorporeal, and the mystical. In doing so, he helped initiate the individualized expressionistic vein of avant-garde art that influenced generations of artists throughout the 20th century. Self-portrait with Baroque. Artist Edouard Vuillard. Vuillard is one of the most renowned members of Lein Nabi, known for his intimate portraits of family and friends, as well as his fixation about decorative patterns. In this bold self-portrait, he centers upon the artist by placing his intense gaze front and center. The broad brush strokes and sketchy depictions of Vuillard's features draw our attention to the materiality of the canvas, while the muted colors signal the artist's departure from observed nature. Thank you for listening. That would be all. And now let's have Mr. Llamedo to continue our reporting.
Thank you so much, Miss. And now, we will continue to the next topic about Fauvism. Fauvism, the first 20th century movement in the modern art, was initially inspired by the example of Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, Georges Seurat, and Paul Cézanne. The Fauves were a loosely allied group of French painters with shared interests. Henri Matisse emerged as the leader of the group, whose members shared the use of intense color as a vehicle for describing light and space, and who redefined pure color and form as a means of communicating the artist's emotional state. Beginning of Fauvism. In the opening years of the 20th century, post-impressionist painters working in France, such as Van Gogh, Gauguin, Seurat, and Cézanne, were considered leaders in avant-garde art. Their collective experiment with paint application, subject matter, expressive line, and pure color were advances that feed the image of Fauvism. Symbolism, with its emphasis on the artist's internal vision, was another important influence. From another source, the European reassessment of African sculpture as art rather than an anthropological curiosity introduced new ideas of form and representation to the European modernist. Okay, that's all. Thank you. And the next reporter goes to Miss Maria Keina Lipitin. She will discuss further about characteristics and artworks of Fauvism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Llamedo. Good day, everyone. And today, I'll discuss about the concepts, styles, and trends on Fauvism. The first one is an expanding circle. Despite initial hostility from critics, many of the Fauves enjoyed commercial success following the Salon d'Automne exhibition of 1905. Their art was featured at additional exhibits held over the following years, notably at the Salon des Indépendants in 1907, where the main attraction was a large room dubbed the Fauves Den. Meanwhile, other artists began to enjoy the central trio of Matisse, Derain, and de Vlaminck. The expanding group of Fauves, all based in France, eventually include Otto Fries, Georges Roult, another student of Gustave Moreau, Kees van Dongen, George Brock, and Roel Duffy. These artists traveled together, shared studios, and exchanged ideas freely during the rather brief heyday of Fauvism. The second one is the primacy of color. All the Fauves were intensely preoccupied with color as a means of personal expression. Color and the combination of colors constituted the intrinsic subject, form, and rhythm of their artwork. A sky could be orange, a tree could be blue, a face could be a combination of seemingly clashing colors. The end result was a wholly independent product of the artist's perception, rather than result, a faithful depiction of the original physical form. Additionally, compositional elements were built up through the placement of color, rather than through perspectival systems or draftsmanship. Lastly, the third one is the subject and style. In their shared preoccupation with expression through color and form, These artists were generally less concerned with the novelty of their subject matter, whereas the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists had depicted scenes of modern urban life such as boulevards, cafes, and concert halls of Paris. The Fauves took more traditional subjects as their starting points. Their subject matter drew from the world around them and included portraits, landscapes, seascapes, and figures in interiors, but the visual impact of the color composition took primacy over any possible narrative or symbolism. Instead, they used their subjects as vehicles of the art acts of observation and painting, with their active brushwork and non-naturalistic color as means of the leading viewer into their inner creative journeys. Let's move on to the important artworks and artists on Fauvism. Lux, Calme et Volupté in 1904 by Henri Matisse. These early works by Matisse clearly indicates the artist's stylistic influences, most notably Georges Seurat's pointillism and Paul Signa's divisionism. In the use of tiny dots of colors to create a visual frisson, what set this work apart from these more rigid methods, however, is Matisse's intense concentrations of pure color, the oranges, yellows, green, and other colors all maintain their own discrete places on the picture plane, never quit merging to form the harmonious tonality. Matisse took this work title, which translates as luxury, peace, and pleasure, from Charles Baudelaire poem The Invitation of Vogue, or Invitation to a Vogue. The second artwork is The River Seine at Chautauqua in 1906 by Maurice de Vlaminck. This scene depicts the portion of the Seine that runs through Chautauqua, the Paris suburb where de Vlaminck and Derain shared a studio beginning in 1901. For the river scene, de Vlaminck used impasto, a technique practiced by many Fauves, thick tubes of paints applied directly from the tube, then brushed together in short strokes to create the effect of movement. The finished effect is one brightness and vibrating motion, detail, and traditional finished perspective matter far less than a sense of buoyant pleasure, as de Vlaminck said, "I try to paint with my heart and my guts without worrying about styles." Lastly, the artwork Painted Acacias, or what we called landscape, in 1907 by André Derain. Derain famously claimed to use color as a means of expressing my emotion and not as a transcription of nature. In this painting, just as in his famous Mountains and Collier in 1905, Derain used long, isolated brush strokes, influenced by divisionist painting, to structure the trees and ground of his landscape. The colors are indeed non-representational, even unnatural. The trees' trunks are almost green. The landscape is abstracted in patches of bright yellow-orange, and the pulsing brushwork and jarring contrast of these colors suggests the shimmering heat of a Mediterranean summer. The next reporter in the topic Expressionism will be discussed by Mr. Mission. That's all for my topic. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you, Ms. Lupitan. Expressionism. Expressionism emerged simultaneously in various cities across Germany as a response to a widespread anxiety about humanity's increasingly discordant relationship with the world and accompanying lost feelings of authenticity and spirituality. In part a reaction against Impressionism and academic art. Expressionism was inspired most heavily by the symbolist currents in late 19th century art. Vincent van Gogh, Edvard Munch, and James Ensor provide particularly influential to the Expressionists, encouraging the distortion of form and the deployment of strong colors to convey a variety of anxieties and yearnings. History of Expressionism started at 1905 and ends at 1933. Beginning of Expressionism. With the turn of the century in Europe, shifts in artistic styles and vision erupted as a response to the major changes in the atmosphere of society. New technologies and massive urbanization efforts altered the individual's worldview, and artists reflected the psychological impact of these developments by moving away from a realistic representation of what they saw toward an emotional and psychological rendering of how the world affects them. The roots of Expressionism can be traced to certain post-impressionist artists like Edvard Munch in Norway, as well as Gustav Klimt of the Vienna Secession. Expressionism: concepts, styles, and trends. Die Broek, Kröfner, Schmidt, Rotloff, Heckel, and Biel. Die Broek was a group of German artists who were influenced by Munch, Van Gogh, and Ensor. In works such as Kröfner Street, Berlin, 1913, they emphasized the alienation inherent to modern society. The group was united by a reductive and primitive aesthetic, a revival of older media and medieval German art. Their name came from a quote from Thus Spoke Zarathustra that states, "What is great in man that he is a bridge and not an end?" The group exhibited and collaborated through 1930 when Kirchner penned Chronic der Broek and the collective effectively dissolved. Der Blue Reader, Kandinsky, Mack, Klee, and Mark. The artists of Der Blue Reader group shared an inclination towards abstraction, symbolic content, and spiritual allusion. They sought to express the emotional aspects of being through highly symbolic and brightly colored renderings. Their name came from a quote from Thus Spoke Zarathustra that states, "What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end." The group was short-lived with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Franz Marc and August Mack were drafted into German military service and died soon after. The Russian members of the group, Vasily Kandinsky, Alexa von Jawlensky, and others, were all killed in the conflict. And to continue the concepts, styles, and trends of Expressionism, let's have Miss Maristela.
Thank you, Mr. Mission. French Expressionism, Rouault, Sautin, and Chagall. Expressionism's elasticity has meant that many artists beyond German's border has been identified with the style. George Rouault, the French artist sometimes described as the Expressionist, has main influenced the Germans more than the other way around. Marc Chagall drew upon the current from Cubism, and Symbolism to create his own brand of Expressionism. Pablo Picasso remarked in the 1950s when Matisse died, Chagall will be the only painter left who understands what color really is. Austrian Expressionism, Kokoschka and Schiele. Austrian artists were inspired by German Expressionism, but interpreted the style in their individual and personalized manner, never forming an official association. Oskar Kokoschka and Egon Schiele sought to express the decadence of modern Austria through similar expressive representation of the human body. By sinuous lines, garish color, and distorted figures, both artists imbued their subject with highly sexual and psychological themes. The important artworks and artists of Expressionism. The Scream, artwork in 1893 by Edward Munch. Throughout his artistic career, Munch focused on scenes of death, agony, anxiety in distorted and emotionally charged portraits, all themes and style that would be adopted by the Expressionists. Here, in Munch's most famous painting, he depicts the battle between the individual and society. The setting of the scream was suggested to the artist while walking along the bridge overlooking Oslo. Although Munch did not observe the scene as rendered in his painting, the scream evokes the jolting emotion of the encounter and exhibit a general anxiety toward the tangible world. The representation of the artist's emotion response to the scene would form the basis of the expressionist artist interpretations. Der Blue Writer, artwork in 1903 by Wesley Kandinsky. This breakthrough canvas is a deceptively simple image, a lone rider racing across a landscape, yet it represents a decisive moment in Kandinsky developing pictorial language. Here, the sun-dappled hillside reveal a keen interest in contrast of light and dark as well as movement and stillness, all major themes throughout his oeuvre, constituting a link between post-impressionism and the burgeoning expressionist movements. Kandinsky canvas become the emblem of the expressive possibility embraced by the Munich avant-garde. Is the eponymous work from which the collective derived its name in 1911. Hans Tetza and Erika Tetza, Conrad. Artwork 1909 by Oskar Kokoschka. The colorful background and concentrated gesture of the figure represent the couple as closed personalities so full of tensions, as the artist once called them. As in many of his portraits, Kokoschka focused on the inner drama of his subjects. Her, using the couple's nervous hands as a focal point of their anxiety, is rendering depict the way the artist perceived the couple's psyche. Not necessarily the physical, naturalistic appearance, Kokoschka emotion represent is emblematic of the expressionist style. The swirling, abstract color that obscure the background and emerge around them are characteristic of Kokoschka frenetic, depthless rendering of the space throughout his oeuvre.
Cubism was a movement of French artists in the early 20th century. The aftermath of Pablo Picasso's shocking 1907 Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, in a period of a rapid experimentation between Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. The movement was one of the most groundbreaking of the early 20th century, as it challenged Renaissance depictions of space, leading directly to experiments with non-representation. History of Cubism. It started at early 1907 and ended at 1922. Beginnings of Cubism. A watershed moment for the development of Cubism was the posthumous retrospective of Paul Cézanne's work at the Salon of the Autumn in 1907. Cézanne's use of generic forms to simplify nature was incredibly influential to both Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. Early Cubism was 1908 to 1909. The early phase of the movement came in the wake of the Paul Cézanne retrospective. In 1907, when many artists were reintroduced or introduced for the first time to the work of Paul Cézanne, several artists who saw the retrospective were influenced by his lack of three-dimensionality, the material quality of his brushwork, and his use of uniform brush strokes. Analytic Cubism. In this phase, Cubism developed in a highly systematic fashion, later to be known as the analytic period of the style. It was based on the close observation of objects in their background context, often showing them from various vantage points. Picasso and Braque restricted their subject matter to the traditional genres of portraiture. Although their works were often similar in appearance, their separate interests showed through over time. Braque tended to show objects exploding out or pulled apart into fragments, while Picasso rendered them magnetized with attracting forces, compelling elements of the pictorial space into the center of composition. Towards the end of this stage of Cubism, Juan Gris began to make contribution to the style. He maintained a sharp clarity to his forms, provided suggestions of a compositional grid, and introduced more color to what had been an austere monochromatic style. Synthetic Cubism, 1912 to 1914. In 1912, Picasso and Braque began to introduce foreign elements into their compositions, continuing their experiments with multiple perspectives. Picasso incorporated wallpaper that imitated chair caning into still life, and Braque began to glue newspaper to his canvases, beginning the movement's exploration of paper coal. In part, this may have resulted from the artist's growing discomfort with the radical abstraction of analytic cubism. Crystal Cubism, 1915 to 1922. As a response to the chaos of war, there was a tendency among French artists to pull back from radical experimentation. This inclination was not unique to Cubism. One art historian has described this stage of Cubism as the end product of a progressive closing down of possibilities. For example, the depicted subjects are hard-edged rather than resembling overlapping bits of low-relief sculpture. Crystal Cubism is associated with Salon Cubism as well as with the works of Picasso and Braque. Crystal Cubism is part of the larger trend known as Return to Order that was associated with artists in the School of Paris. Mr. Miasco will be continuing the report for Cubism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Medrina, and hello everybody. My name is Mr. Miasco, and I'll be tackling all about the important artworks and artists of Cubism. So the first artwork will be the Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 1907 by Pablo Picasso. Their blunt sexuality was heightened by Picasso's influence from non-Western art that is most evident in their faces of three of the women, which are rendered as mask-like, suggesting that their sexuality is not just aggressive but also primitive. The unusual formal elements of the painting were also part of its shock value. Picasso abandoned the Renaissance illusions of three-dimensionality, instead presenting a radical flattened picture plane that is broken up into geometric shards. For instance, the body of the standing woman in the center is composed of angle and sharp edges. Both of the cloth wrapped around her lower body and her body itself are given the same amount of attention as the negative space around them, as if all in the foreground are all equally important. The next painting will be The Houses at El Estaque 1908 by Georges Braque. In this painting, Braque shows the influence of Picasso's Les Demoiselles of the previous year in the work of Paul Cézanne. He adapted the unidirectional uniform brushworks and the flat spacing, while from Picasso he took the radical simplification of the use of geometric shapes to define objects. For example, there is no horizon line and no use of traditional shading to add depth of the objects, so that the houses and the landscapes all seems to overlap and to occupy the foreground of the picture plane. As whole, these works made obvious his allegiance to Picasso's experiments and lead to their collaboration. The third painting will be The Violin and Palette 1909 by Georges Braque. By 1909, Picasso and Braque were collaborating, painting largely interior scenes that includes reference to music, such as musical instruments or sheet music. In this early example of analytic cubism, Braque was experimenting further with shallow spacing by reducing the color of the palette to neutral browns and grays that further flatten out the space. The piece is also indicative of Braque attempts to show the same item from a different point of view. Some shading is used to create an impression of bas relief with the various geometric shapes seeming to overlap slightly. Musical instruments such as guitars, violins, and clarinets show up frequently in Cubist paintings, particularly in the works of Braque, who trained as a musician. By relying on such repeated subject matter, the works also encourage the viewer to concentrate on the stylistic innovations of Cubism rather than on the specificity of the subject matter. Thank you, and the next reporter will be Miss Miago.
Here is the summary in today's lesson. Post-Impressionism encompasses a wide range of distinct artistic styles that all share the common motivation of responding to the opticality of the Impressionist movement. The Post-Impressionism has these characteristics: Soriate and Pointillism, Van Gogh and Japonisme, Gauguin and Scintillism, Cézanne and the structure of pictorial form, Rousseau and Primitivism, Les Nabis. Fauvism, the first 20th century movement in modern art, was initially inspired by the examples of Van Vincent Gogh, Paul Gauguin, Georges Seurat, and Paul Cézanne. Characteristics of Fauvism: an expanding circle, the primacy of color, subject, and style. Expressionism emerged simultaneously in various cities across Germany as a response to widespread anxiety about humanity's increasingly discordant relationship with the world and accompanying lost feelings of authenticity and spirituality. Characteristics of Expressionism: Dierpoku, Kirchner, Schmidt Rudolph, Haeckel and Bayle, de Blas-Rideau, Kandinsky, Mackie, Klee, and Mark. French Expressionism, Roth, Sotin, and Kangal. Austrian Expressionism, Kokoschka and Schill. Cubism was a movement of French artists in the early 20th century in the aftermath of Pablo Picasso's shocking 1907 Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, in a period of rapid experimentation between Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. Characteristics of Cubism. Early Cubism in 1908 to 1909, Analytic Cubism in 1910 to 1912, Synthetic Cubism in 1912 to 1914, and Crystal Cubism in 1915 to 1922. Here is the quote of the day. Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working, by Pablo Picasso. That's all for today's lesson, and thank you for listening. Have a good day.